Hello everyone, thank you for being here tonight, and thank you very much to the organizers for planning such an interesting event. It's been interesting so far for me. I'd like just to ask those of you that are out in the hallway, please come on in. If you don't mind, there's plenty of spots to sit up here on the floor so you're not quite as far back. It might hurt your neck by the end, but please come in and join us if you can. Or here along the wall. Thank you. Come on in. Thank you. So I've warned my students at several points, you don't ever want to go shopping with me. Why? Well, I am interested in the relationship, some of what Jamie had sketched out in terms of global value chains. I'm interested in the link between production and consumption. My particular interest over the last 10 years or so has been in the global clothing industry. So just be warned, don't ever go shopping with me, because it takes a heck of a long time. I'm constantly looking at labels to see where garments are made, or in the case of the skirt I'm wearing today, I could see that it was made in Canada, but it was made with textiles that were imported from China, which is usually the case if we're buying anything that has been made in Canada. It's with imported textiles. So what I want to do in the 10 minutes I have today is just give you a broad outline of the history of the industry at a global level. And as Patrick was pointing out, I want to draw particular attention to some of the global regulations, the global agreements and regulations that has really shaped the global patterns around production. And then what I want to do is talk about some of the recent trends. And the first presentation certainly did that with reference to Bangladesh. And I wanted to expand that by talking about some of the broader changes that are happening, Bangladesh obviously being key to that. So as I'm sure many of you already know, or you've gotten a bit of a sense from the presentations already, the clothing industry is labor intensive, the skills needed and capital requirements are low, and the products very easily transported. Consequently, the growth and the spread of the clothing industry around the world has been driven largely based on price, with competitive advantage determined for the most part by labor, by the cost of labor. And indeed, I would argue there is probably no other industry where the relationship between trade and labor standards, or trade and working conditions, is so immediate and so closely intertwined, and where the connection then between the global and the local can become so explicit, in some ways more than other commodity chains. So it's therefore not surprising that the garment industry was regulated, as Patrick noted already, by a special agreement. The multi-fiber arrangement introduced in 1974, but there was an agreement in place before that. So as early as 1961, an agreement was put in place. Why? Well, at that point in time, Japan had emerged as a major producer and exporter of clothing, and the products that were being exported from Japan were generally at a much lower price than products being made in Europe and in North America. So North America, in particular the United States, but Canada and a number of European countries came together to put an agreement in place that would basically protect their industries from cheaper imports, and at that time it was from Japan. So the long-term arrangement regarding international trade in cotton, textiles, and substitutes, otherwise simply known as the LTA, was put in place in 1962. And then in 1974, the MFA, the multi-fiber arrangement, was put in place. Initially, these two agreements were largely aimed, as I said, at Japan, but increasingly they were aimed at protecting the industry in North America and Europe from the emergence of a number of other lower cost producers, most of which were in Asia. So what we ended up with was an industry that was highly regulated. So it's no surprise then that agreement and a number of bilateral agreements basically shaped where clothes were produced, where garments were produced, and where they were exported to. What happened? Well, countries are tricky. Firms are especially clever and tricky. So what started to happen was called quota hopping. So for example, when one country had reached the quota in terms of their exports to North America, to Europe, they would then, and again, because it's so easy to do so with the clothing factory, they would establish a new factory somewhere else in the world. They would then produce clothes from that country and continue to export them to Europe, to North America. And when their quota was reached from that country, they would set up another sister company, another factory somewhere else. So this process of quota hopping basically shaped the garment industry globally. So I'll just give you one example of that. Mauritius is an excellent example. There was basically no clothing industry in Mauritius up until the late 1970s, and as a result of quota hopping, Hong Kong firms established clothing factories in Mauritius and began to produce the bulk of their clothes then in Mauritius and use the base of Mauritius to then export to their main buyers. So we have then countries emerging as new producers as a result of this quota hopping. So let me fast forward. With the multi-fiber agreement winding down, so the 10-year transition period between 1994, 2004, 2005, the expectation was that there would be major winners, that China would be the major winner or the major beneficiary, and a few other Asian countries, in addition to some Latin American countries like Mexico, and the feeling was that Africa would be the main loser. So countries like Mauritius that had benefited before would basically have their industry gutted. So number one, the expectation was this reshaping of global production, with China being the main winner and a handful of other countries. So really, the industry, it was expected, would become more concentrated around a small number of countries. And the second prediction was that there would become more symmetrical relations in the value chains. So to put that another way, and if you think about what Jamie has just outlined in terms of the value chain, that there would start to be a more equal power relationship between suppliers and retailers, between producers and buyers. Has this happened? The latter has certainly not happened. And in fact, what we've seen is a more hierarchical power relationship where buyers have more and more power. And in terms of the first, has this happened? For the most part, yes, but not really as predicted. So China has emerged as one of the major exporters of clothing. Just to give you an idea very quickly, between 2005 and 2011 alone, the amount of clothing exported from China increased by 107%. So China, by about 2010, was producing well over a third of the world's garments. But a couple of things very quickly, and my time is running out. One thing that has been happening, and especially in the last few years, is wages in China have gone up and continue to go up. China has also been moving into much higher value added manufacturing goods, and so has been moving away from cheaper garments. So firms have now been looking to relocate out of China to other places, mostly low-wage countries in Asia and in Africa. So a lot of the production that's happening in Bangladesh now is a result of the kind of redistribution of global production, partly because of China now moving out, or beginning to move out, and wages going up so much. The other thing that's happened is a number of new suppliers are emerging. So a number of African countries are now emerging as key global suppliers where they hadn't in the past. So some of the biggest growth that we've seen in terms of exports has come from new suppliers, African suppliers. So just to wrap up, Ben, given what I've said in terms of the history, what would I point to? And you'll have to just take this up later in the Q&A, or we can chat later. What are some of the key developments today? So I'll just list them. Number one, rising wages in China and the steady shift away from China. Parallel to that is the emergence of new country producers, and linked to that, the growing number of, or increased exports from existing producers. Bangladesh would be a good example, Cambodia, India, who produced before, but are now increasing their share of global exports. A third change has been, I would argue, an increased fragmentation of the global value chain. So intermediaries at a global level, intermediaries at a local level, and increased fragmentation. So what I mean by that would be in a country where I've done research like South Africa. More clothing production is happening by home workers or by those in informal factories rather than in formal factories. So formal factories get a contract. Levi's gives a contract to a Levi's factory in South Africa. They then outsource to home workers, to informal factories. So the increased fragmentation and overall decline in wages. Lower wages at an international level, at the same time you see rising wages in a place like China. That's all I have time for now. Please feel free to take up any of these issues in the Q&A or while we're snacking outside. Thank you so much.